Well, thanks, Ari, for that intro and also for all those amazing resources that you've been sending after each class. It's good to be with you all this afternoon. So we are still in the middle of our three-part session in which we're exploring the question of the language of prayer. Can we pray in any language? Can we only pray in Hebrew? Are there certain prayers that have to be said in Hebrew and other prayers that can be said in any language? And we are asking this question while we track the halachic development, the Jewish legal development of this question from the times of the Mishna, the Tosefta, to the Talmud, to the later sources between 1000 to 1500 CE. And then ultimately in our next session, next week, our final session in this unit, we're going to be tracking it through the Achronim, the later sources, 1600 and even sort of up to current day. And one of the things that I was sort of arguing last week that we think I really saw in your answers and the way you were thinking about it is that this is not just a cut and dry legal question, can you or can't you, which language or which prayer, but actually there are a lot of different values at tension with one another, that the way you, yes, I'll absolutely share the sources in a minute, or maybe Ari can already share, I'll share the link to the source sheet in a minute. That the way in which you answer this question of what language can you pray in reveals what do you think prayer is really all about. Is prayer about tapping into the community and being part of the communal process? Is prayer about tapping into community in years past and forward that we're all davening in the same language going back, hundreds and even thousands of years, and going forward that we're all saying the same thing? Is prayer about my individual relationship with God? Such that actually what I'm saying or what I'm not saying, many of you are raising actually the possibility that prayer is not only about words, it's also just about what's going on in our hearts, but that it's really about prayer is not necessarily about my community, it's about my one-on-one relationship with God and what I'm communicating. That how you answer the question of what language you can pray in reveals what you think prayer is really about and what the values are. So we're continuing exploring that today. I wanted to, before we dive into the sources today, ultimately where we're going to get in this session is we're going to be looking at the Rishonim. So we're going to be looking at the commentators that are between 1000 and 1500 CE. But before we get there, I want to just do a really quick recap of what the Mishnah is, what the Tosefta is, what the Talmud is. I want to recap their positions for you so that then when we dive into the Rishonim, you'll understand what they're responding to. So just a reminder, what is the Mishnah? So the Mishnah and the Tosefta, those are two different bodies of work that share a lot of similarities that were created in the same time period between 0 and 200 CE. We said last week that the Mishnah and also the Tosefta were the rabbis' first attempt to make a Jewish legal code from the Torah, which the Torah is really not a law book. It has laws in there, but it's not organized as a law book. You can't, want to know the laws on Shabbat and know where to look in there. So the Mishnah and the Tosefta are organized in 6 different orders called starim that are thematic. There's one on holidays, one on, I'm not going to say them all now because this is a recap, but one on holidays and one on women and one on purity and one on sort of consecrated holy objects. And then those starim, those orders are subdivided into smaller tractates. And the rabbis in the times of the Mishnah, they were called Tanaim. So this is a bit of new information. The rabbis between 0 to 200 CE, these are the rabbis whose names we actually see populating the Mishnah and the Tosefta. They're called Tanaim, and it comes from a word that actually means to repeat or to teach, because remembering that the Mishnah then was all oral, and so those rabbis, when they were transmitting the Mishnah, what they were doing is they were really just repeating the learning that they had heard in other places. They were the repeaters from the 0 to 200 CE. And then it came along that even the rabbis just one generation later, so the rabbis in like 200 CE and on, they already didn't exactly know what the rabbis of the Mishnah meant. When the rabbis said this, what did they mean? How do we apply it? What is it referring to? So the Talmud, or the Gemara, is the later rabbis' attempt to understand, apply, dissect, and debate the Mishnah. So the Gemara, or the Talmud, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, that's the commentary on the Mishnah, and that is from 200 to 500 CE. And the rabbis of the times of the Gemara, they are called Amoraim. So you have the Tanaim, which is in the times of the Mishnah. Those are the repeaters. The Amoraim, it comes from the Hebrew word le'emor, lomar, to say. They're like the sayers, because it was the Amorim that start saying things. They start expanding on the Mishnah. The Tanaim are just repeating what they've heard so that we can memorize it and it stays with us. It's the Amoraim in the times of the Talmud that they are saying and explicating and expanding. So those are the Amorim in the times of the 200 to 500 CE. And we also said last week that there are actually two different Talmuds that are being developed concurrently. One was being developed in the land of Israel, and one was being developed in Babylonia. The Babylonian Talmud got redacted a little bit later than the Talmud that was being developed in the land of Israel. And as such, it's better, it's sort of more nicely edited. It's a little bit easier to learn to the extent that Talmud is ever easy to learn. And it's also just become, because it's sort of more nicely redacted and clearer, in general, the Babylonian Talmud is more commonly studied. I saw there was a question in the chat, so this is a good time. Were copies of the Mishnah, Tosefta, and Talmud prepared as strictly as the Torah, so no changes or errors were possible? That's a very interesting question, Arnold. I mean, I'm not sure. What I'll say here, I'll give this answer, which is that there's a ton of difference, remembering that it was all an oral transmission. So actually there are a lot of different, like when people are learning Mishnah, Tosefta, and Talmud, people who are really scholars on it will study manuscripts, because there's a lot of different manuscripts, and different manuscripts might have really significant changes and edits. So part of real scholarly learning is actually looking through manuscripts. So whether or not they were trying to prepare them strictly, that I can't say. My guess is that they were trying to do it as close as possible, but the reality is that there is a fair amount of difference, and sometimes difference in, like, you know, it's the omission of one word that will make the sentence mean the exact opposite thing. And you sometimes do find that between manuscripts, which can be really challenging. And there are manuscripts for Mishnah, Tosefta, and Talmud, and there are even ways of gaining, I mean, I don't have access to it, but like people who are, you know, PhD scholars, you can even start tracking these manuscripts online, which is sort of amazing and beautiful that they have access to this world of sort of handwritten manuscripts, even from the internet, from a computer. That's a great question. Before we go on, I would be totally remiss if we talked about the Gemara and you didn't get to see a page of Gemara, because normally if we were doing this live, I would want to open up a Gemara to show you Gemara. I'll say for me, I think that a daf of Gemara, so daf is page, a daf of Gemara is one of the most beautiful things we have. And this goes to something that Ari was saying, that's something that he was saying that he thinks is so amazing about Gemara, is the way in which it's actually, the Gemara is rabbis from different generations being put in conversation with each other. That's something that we sort of we take for granted, that it reads like a steady flow of conversation. But oftentimes Gemara is this rabbi who never would have met this rabbi is being put in conversation. And then you'll even have the sort of the anonymous hand, the anonymous editor of the Gemara, who's putting these voices in conversation with each other, might say, well, so-and-so disagrees with so-and-so. Well, so-and-so would say back to that person this. And well, then so-and-so would hypothetically say back to this person this. And you have these constructed arguments of like, well, what would it be like if you put this rabbi from, let's say, the 3rd century in conversation with this rabbi from the 5th century? What would be the conversation and debate that they would have? Would you finally be able to get them to agree with each other, or would they always disagree? And you see that when you look at a page of Gemara. So I'm going to go ahead and actually share my screen now, because I want you to get to see a page of Gemara. Hopefully it won't be too small for you. Okay. So you guys, you're seeing my screen now, okay? So what we're looking at here, this is, if you wanted to pull this up yourself, this is, I typed it in Hebrew, but I typed in Sorata Daf, which means like this page here is referred to Sorata Daf, meaning that you're not seeing like I copied and pasted the text from some document, but Sorah is the shape of, you're actually seeing the shape of the Daf, the shape of the Gemara page. You see here, if you follow my pointer, at the top of the page right here, you have the daf that we're on, the page number. So this in Hebrew, Chaf Daled is 24. So this is 24a, that's the page number this is referring to. Ze Borer is the name of the chapter this is in. This is not what we're actually studying today. This is just a random page that I pulled. This is the name of the chapter. Perek Shlishi, this is in the 3rd Perek. This is in Tractate Sanhedrin right here. And this is the heart of it, literally the heart of it. In the heart of a daf of Gemara, if you're seeing this for the first time, it's an amazing document. You have the text of the Gemara itself. So that's this middle column right here. If you look down with me to where, it's about 2/3 of the page, you might see there's a mem, taf, nun, yud that's a little bit bigger. This is the Mishnah. That means matnitin, our Mishnah. And so the way that the Gemara works is it's going to quote a passage of Mishnah. And then right here where it says Gimel Mem, then you have the Gemara. This is going to be the commentary that's on this little bit of Mishnah. You can't see this because if we flip the page, it's very likely that the Gemara, the commentary in that Mishnah would go on for pages and pages and pages, that you would have pages and pages and pages of commentary on just this 5-line Mishnah. So it's you don't have a quoted bit of Mishnah on every page of Gemara, but it just happens that this one that I chose, you get to see a little bit of the quoted Mishnah and then the commentary. So that's all right here. That's the center column. Everything that you see around it, this beautiful here and here and here, these are all different commentaries from different time periods. So already you have the Mishnah, remember, 0 to 200 CE. So those are those rabbis. The Gemara is the later rabbis from 200 to 500 CE. Then you have here on, it looks like the outside, really this would be the inside. If you were looking at this, this would be the left. Then you open the page, you open the Gemara, this page would be on the left. So this writing here would be on the inside. This commentary right here, this is Rashi from the 11th century. So Rashi both is a major commentator on the Torah that we looked at in our first session. Rashi is also a major commentary in the Talmud. So this is Rashi. You see it's in a special sort of Rashi script that the publisher came up with just to make Rashi's commentary clearly different than the Talmud. So this is Rashi writing in the 11th century being put in conversation. Then you have the Tosafots here, that's on this side. The Tosafots are more like 12th, 13th, and 14th century. So you have those voices. Oftentimes, so Rashi's commenting on the Gemara, the Tosafots will often be commenting, like right here, if you look, you're not gonna be able to see this, it's very small. But right here, my cursor says, it says, Piresh HaKontrus, that's referring to Rashi. So the Tosafos, so let's say this is 13th, 14th century, they're opening their commentary by quoting Rashi. So you have Rashi who's commenting on the Mishnah, on the Gemara. So just as Ari was saying, what the page of Gemara is encapsulating is this cross-century conversation that it's like you're getting a flash out of it, like a whole frame of it right on a daf of Gemara. And then you even have a lot of later commentaries you have here. This is directing you to legal sources. So where if you wanted to, the Gemara is not ultimately a law book in terms of wanting bottom line halakha, bottom line Jewish law. It's not going to tell you what to do. So then here, this is saying, okay, and if you want to see where the Gemara, where this piece of Gemara, what the bottom line law is in like the 16th century Jewish legal works, check it out here. So then this is driving you to the 16th century. So we started out 0 to 200 C in the Mishnah, and already now we're in the 16th century with these legal codes. This is telling you what verses are being referenced. So there's a lot of stuff on the page that I'm not going to get into, but I just wanted to show you, I think that a page of Gemara is just a beautiful work of art in terms of encapsulating Judaism as a live and vibrant ongoing conversation and debate between different rabbis of different centuries. And that when we are learning the Gemara, we're stepping into this conversation with our own 21st, 20th century voices. We're getting to be a part of this conversation and adding just another layer onto an already really textured and layered document. Okay, I'll stop screen sharing there. Any questions about any of that? Okay, so if you have questions, feel free to chat them in. And if I don't get them now, I'll get them on the next time that we turn to the chat. Okay, so before we actually dive back into the sources, I wanted to just re-summarize where we were last week because we're continuing on. So we were, again, looking at the question of prayer, and we saw that the Mishnah, so I think I'll actually just go into a screen sharing mode so you can start peeking at the sources yourself. And I'll share the document again in the chat if that's helpful. There you go. So if you want to open it up on your own, you're welcome to do that. Here we go. Make my screen a little bit bigger for you. Okay, so last week we started with the Mishnah. It was in the Mishnah Sota, and we saw that the Mishnah said, "Elu ne'amrin b'kol lashon." These are the prayers that can be said in any language. And the two prayers that we're really going to focus on, that we're going to keep tracking today, is specifically the Shema and the Amidah. And the Amidah, we said, was called Tefillah. It's just called Tefillah straight up. That anytime you see Tefillah, you know it's standing in for the Amidah. And we thought it was really interesting that actually the rabbis were saying, you might have thought that wouldn't be the case. I don't know that that would be my impulse, that the rabbis would say that you could say Shema and the Amidah in any language. But according to the Mishnah, you can, which is really interesting. And we talked about what are some of the values that might be at stake and why the rabbis were making prayer accessible in that way. We saw in the Tosefta, so remembering the Tosefta is being compiled at the same time, it's just it doesn't get canonized into the Mishnah, but it's concurrent material. It's from the Tannaitic material from 0 to 200 CE. We saw again that same position. Shema and Tefillah, ne'emrim b'kol lashon, can be said in any language. So you have that same inclusivity, accessibility. But now we see something different. We see, and Rebbe Omer, and Rebbe being quoted is always going to be Rebbe Yehuda Hanesi. Rebbe Omer ani she'ein shma ne'emar ele b'lashon hakodesh. So Rebbe says, I disagree with the Mishnah and with this opening position of the Tosefta. Rebbe says, actually, Shema stands out. Shema is different than all these other prayers. Shema, unlike these other prayers, unlike the Amidah, can only be said in Hebrew, the Lashon HaKodesh. Why? He brings a proof text for it. He quotes from the paragraph that talks about Shema, the paragraph that's in the Torah that talks about we should say Shema, Vehayu hadrim ha'ele, and these words that I command you today. And the idea being that Rebbe takes a really literal interpretation, that Rebbe says, well, the Torah said these words, so it must be these exact words in Hebrew that are quoted in the Torah, not some other translation of those words. So in general, the Mishnah and Tosefta are saying very permissive in any language. And it's Rebbe who is taking a minority position to say, well, but Shema is different. Okay, so that we saw last week. We then, oh, it looks like I didn't bring the Urushami for you here. Oh, that's a shame. Okay, well, it's not a shame because I can just go to my other tab and I'm screen sharing. Okay, amazing. We then also saw a bit of the Urushami quickly, which I just want to go over. The Urushami then opens and says, yeah, Shema, you can say in any language. How do we know that you can say Shema in any language? It says so right here. It says, V'dibarta bam, you should speak of them. How should you speak of them? In the language that you speak. And then again, we have the machloket, we have the disagreement with Rebbe, where Rebbe says, no, I disagree with bringing the V'dibarta bam, that you should speak meaning any language. I say Shema can only be said in Hebrew. How do we know that? Again, same proof text, the same verse is being used. It says, and these words that I command you today, it must be these words, okay? So Rebbe is being set up against the Mishnah and Tosefta, which say any language. Rebbe says Shema can only be in Hebrew. And then we got this really interesting story. The story was Rabbi Levi Bar Haidi went to Caesarea and he heard voices reading the Shema in Greek, which should have been okay. According to the Mishnah, according to the Tosefta, that is totally permissible. They were within their right. And yet Rabbi Levi Bar Cheta, that he didn't appreciate it. He didn't like it. He wanted to stop them. Apparently, you could sort of guess why. It'd be interesting to know why, but apparently he was not into the idea that Shema could be said in any other language. He thought Shema should be said only in Lashon HaKodesh, maybe because he's following Rabbi Yehuda Hanesi, maybe because he thinks that Shema is the communal prayer, so it has to be said in the communal language. Maybe he thinks it has a special holiness, so it has to be said in the holy language. He didn't want to be contaminated by Greek, by the everyday language. Whatever it is, he feels like a real aversion to the Shema being said in Greek, even though these people are totally in line with the Mishnah and Tosefta. So he wants to stop them. Rabbi Yossi heard about this, and he got angry at Rabbi Levi. And he says, sort of indignantly, he says, here's what I'm saying. Should a person who doesn't know Hebrew not say the Shema at all? Rabbi Yossi protests, and he says, I mean, first of all, he's saying, actually, they have Jewish law on their side. They're following the Mishnah and Tosefta. But he says, what are you saying? Are you saying that these people who don't know Hebrew should not be able to say the Shema? Basically, Rabbi Yossi is making an argument for inclusion, that if we want Jewish prayer, if we want, the Shema is the central, most important Jewish prayer. If we want this prayer to be accessible to people, all people, they have to be able to say it in the language that they speak. And Rabbi Levi, you getting all uppity about them saying it in Greek, you are basically, the end result of it is you're going to have less people be able to say the Shema. And isn't that a problem? And so ultimately, the end of this text in the Urushami is going to uphold the position of the Mishnah and the Tosefta saying, no, prayer should be in any language. Why? We're giving two different reasons. One here, so that a person will know how to ask for their needs, which is so beautiful. This is the idea of what's behind prayer. Prayer essentially is about you asking for what you need. It's about your relationship to God. It's about you articulating what is lacking or what you're needing. And you have to be able to do that in the language that you speak. It doesn't make sense to force that into a language that you don't understand. So one is prayer is about asking for what you need. And so it only makes sense for you to ask for what you need in a language you understand. And two, this is specifically on why the blessing after the meals should be said in the language you speak, so that you'll know whom the one you're blessing is. I think that there's something beautiful about that it's not only do you need to be able to pray in the language you speak so that you're able to articulate what you need, but it's like, it's as if you're praying in a foreign language that you don't understand, you won't even really, it creates a disconnect in your relationship with the one to whom you're praying. That if you want to be able to know to whom you're praying, it has to be in words and language that you actually understand. So the Urushami, even though we had this position of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi saying Shema only in Hebrew, and even though we have Rabbi Levi Bar Chayta getting all upset and uppity about the Shema in Greek, ultimately the Urushami upholds an expansive vision of prayer that maintains that prayer should be in any language so that you know what you're saying, so that you know whom you're blessing. Okay, we're going to read one more text together to sort of finish up what we were working on last week, and then I'll take some questions and thoughts, and then we'll keep going into the Rishonim, the later rabbis. So this is the Urushami. Again, just emphasizing, saying that there are the two different Talmuds. There's the one that's being developed in the land of Israel and one that's being developed in Babylon. So this is the Talmud that was being developed in the land of Israel. Ultimately, the Talmud that's being developed in the land of Israel comes down, even though it has those little minority positions, ultimately says expansive vision, prayer in any language, so you know what you're saying and you can say what you need. Okay, then we go to Tractate Sota here, but this is from the Talmud that's being developed in the land of Babylon. So it's the same tractate, it's dealing with the same general content, but it's being developed in a different geographic area by different rabbis, and it's going to come out with a different position. So let's take a look at Tractate Sota, being developed in the land of Babylon from the Talmud Bavli. So what is prayer? It says, prayer is a request for mercy, and one prays however one needs to. Okay, that sounds like what we were hearing from the Urushami, that prayer is essentially about asking for what you need. It's about asking for mercy for God, and that you need to be able to pray that in any language that you speak, in the language that you speak, so you can communicate your needs. And can tefillah indeed be in any language? So it just makes the Gemara this is very Gemara. It's very Gemara to make an assertion and then to challenge its own statement. So the Gemara just said prayer in any language, and then it's going to say tefillah b'kol lashon, but can you really pray in any language? And now it's going to bring a proof for how we know that you actually can't pray in any language. Okay, it asserts you can pray in any language, and then it's going to say, but really, can you pray in any language? But don't I know this other thing that indicates that I can't? So this is like a very Gemara move, the back and forth between different opinions, trying to figure out what's the real truth. Okay, can you really say the Amidah in any language? Did not Rabbi Yehuda say one should never ask for one's needs in Aramaic? We just said that you can pray in any language. The Mishna says you can pray in any language. The Tosefta says you can pray in any language. The Urushami ultimately says you can pray in any language. But now we have this quote from a Rav Yehuda, a major Amora in the time of the Gemara, who says one should never ask for one's needs in Aramaic. Now, Aramaic is a random language to us. It's not a random language to them because that's what they're speaking in Babylonia. This is the language that they are all speaking. This language really matters to them. And here we're saying you should not actually ask for your needs in Aramaic, which is the language that all you guys speak. How do we know this? Quoting Rabbi Yochanan, another Amora, anyone who asks for his needs in Aramaic is not attended by the ministering angels, because the ministering angels do not recognize Aramaic. So here's something interesting here. Why can you not ask for prayer in any, specifically in Aramaic? Or it's hard to know here. Should we read Rabbi Yehuda saying, you should never ask for your needs specifically in Aramaic, but any other language is okay? Or Aramaic is subbing in for any language that is not Lashon HaKodesh, any language that is not Hebrew? It's not clear how to read this. And Rabbi Yochanan, and he quotes Rabbi Yochanan saying, why can you not ask in Aramaic? Because the angels don't understand Aramaic, and you need the angels to help get your prayer up to God. This is potentially like a bit of a foreign, there might be a lot of things that you're thinking now, like A, didn't know that Judaism had angels, B, didn't know that like angels were ferrying our prayers up to God. There's a lot of stuff going on here. But in short, I would say the idea that they're tapping into is a sense in which whether or not you believe that angels are ferrying our prayers up to God, the idea that sometimes our prayers need a little bit of extra support, a little bit of extra elevation. And it seems like Rabbi Yochanan believes that the angels are serving that role of sometimes the prayer of the individual needs a little bit of help getting before God, and it's the angels that are doing that. But if the angels don't understand Aramaic and you're praying in Aramaic, then they can't exactly help you out. The point, and this is a challenge on the Mishna and the Tosefta that say you can pray in any language, and now suddenly we're hearing, well, but you can't pray in Aramaic, and that's the language that everyone speaks. So now we have a major dilemma. This is classic Gemara of, we said one thing, the Mishna says one thing, pray in any language, Amidah in any language, and now we hear, but actually it can't be in Aramaic, which is the language everyone's speaking, and so now we have a contradiction, and we have to try to, what the Gemara is going to want to do is when there's a contradiction, the Gemara is going to want to resolve it. So how does the Gemara resolve the contradiction? Don't pray in Aramaic, pray in any language. Okay, very easy. The Gemara says, do you actually get these nice words here? So this is classic Gemara. The Gemara says, lo kasha. It's not difficult. I just laid out why something was really difficult and a big problem, and the Gemara says, don't worry, lo kasha. It's not difficult. It's not a difficulty. Why? Habi yachid, one of these texts that says, you can pray either, you can pray in any language, or you can only pray in any language, or don't pray in Aramaic. One of these is referring to individual prayer, and one of these is referring to communal prayer. What the Gemara doesn't do, if you're feeling confused, is it doesn't map out which is which. It doesn't say, so now you have to do the guesswork and saying, they're saying, we have two different positions that seem to be contradictory. Don't worry, they're not contradictory. They're referring to different types of prayer. One of them is referring to communal prayer, and one of them is referring to individual prayer. Now, I'm going to do the mapping out for you because it's just too complicated to figure out. They're saying the text in which we said you can pray in any language, see if you can guess. Just think for a second before I tell you the answer. You can pray in any language. Do you think that's talking about communal prayer or individual prayer? Why don't you take a second and throw it into the chat? You can pray in any language. Do you think that's referring to communal prayer or individual prayer? Okay, amazing. We're getting a lot of votes for individual prayer. It makes sense. Why? I imagine you could spell this out for you, but it makes sense. Prayer in any, your individual prayer is your individual prayer, and so you should be able to pray in your individual language in any language. So I think all of your impulses make sense there, and that is not how the Gemara resolves it. It's the opposite, which is why it's so surprising, which is why I wanted you to guess. Prayer in any language, that is communal prayer. You can't pray in Aramaic. That is referring to individual prayer. So let me map it out again, and then I want to hear your thoughts on why you think this is the resolution, why this makes sense. Okay, prayer in any language, if you're davening in a community, in a tzibur, you can pray in whatever language you want. But if you're davening alone at home, then you have to either, it's not clear, but if you have it, minimally you can't daven in Aramaic, assuming Aramaic is the language you speak, or that you have to daven in Hebrew. So why do you think that would be? If you're praying in a community, you can daven in any language you want, but if you're praying home alone, then you have to daven in, Hebrew, or at least not Aramaic. What sense does that make? So Rena, I'd love to hear more about what you're saying, but my guess reading into your comment, the community controls the content, is we can afford to let you take liberties with the language because at least the content we know is standardized. So there's a little bit more room for you to sort of bring your own language into it there. Oh, good. So Marion says, so why in the community can you daven in any language? Marion says, this is an interesting idea. Someone in the community will be praying in Hebrew and the angels will get it. So if you have the community, the idea is like, well, so Marion, you're sort of implying there still needs to be someone davening in Hebrew, but we can afford to let people be davening in many different languages because you can count at least someone is doing it, and that person will sort of, their prayer will help, get the angels to boost onto it. I like that idea, whereas if I'm praying at home and I'm not praying in Hebrew, I can't count on the fact that there's someone else that's going to cover that for me. That's very interesting. Ria, I think this is beautiful. Any language in the community, the cacophony, that there's something positive about the idea of this cacophony of the different languages coming together. That reminds me back to, we started out last week, the story of the Tower of Babel, and that actually the one language, one voice was a problem, and what God wanted at the end of it was the diversity, that there's actually could be something beautiful about. You would think, right, our impulse is to think that communal davening, we want it all to sound the same, everyone to be saying the same prayer, the same language, and actually there might be a beautiful cacophony if everyone is saying the same prayer, but in their own language. Right, so Rena's saying, going back to the community controlling the content, that private prayer contained inappropriate prayer, so we want to, the community is containing some control over that. Good, so ultimately that is where the rabbis are going to go, Okay, good. So Susan, I'm going to come to your comment. Hopefully we're going to see your comment later. So Susan was asking, how do we know that the angels only understand Hebrew, or more specifically, don't understand Aramaic? That's the Sota text is implying that the angels don't understand Aramaic. And we're going to see a later text that's actually going to disagree with that and take issue with that. But the idea here of the Sota, the text from the Sota, is it's a drastic, the Sota has a conflict between the Mishna and Tosefta say, pray in any language. And then we have this text from a later Amora, a later rabbi saying, well, actually, you can't pray in Aramaic, which is the language that they care about. So we have a major contradiction. It resolves them by saying, oh, well, when the Mishnah and Tosefta said that you could pray in any language, it was only talking about communal prayer when you're praying as a community. But individual prayer, that still's got to be at least not in Aramaic, but maybe even in Hebrew. So part of what the Gemara is doing is it's trying to resolve a difficulty, but ultimately what it does is it really narrows the scope of the Mishnah. So whereas the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Urushami all basically said pray in any language, the bottom line of the Bavli here, of the Babylonian Talmud, is you can only pray in any language when you're praying in a community, but that still is going to leave a ton of prayer, all of your personal individual prayer, you're now locked into, if not Aramaic, maybe even into saying it in Hebrew. So it has really minimized the scope of it.
And just a question, I'm sure people are wondering, how do you know from the text Haba Yachid, Haba Tzibor is referring to which one it's referring to, since there is no reference?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Sometimes it's really not clear. I don't have the daf in front of me. There's a decent chance. So this is actually a really popular formation to have a difficulty set up between two different seemingly contradicting statements, and then a low kasha, and then it's like, well, this applies to this and this applies to this, and then you as a learner are left figuring out how to map it out. Sometimes you have no help and you really feel like you could apply it in either direction. You could argue it could make sense. Sometimes you just have to sort of logic it out, and it's like, well, it actually logics out better in one direction. Sometimes you can only understand it, you can only figure it out with the context and the flow of the rest of the text that follows. So you'd have to read on to figure out why one might make sense. And sometimes this would be a place where I would turn to Rashi. Sometimes Rashi will explain it for you to explain out how it maps on. Meanwhile, all right, that's actually a good question. Assuming that you hadn't figured this out, that it was not clear, that's actually going to take us to our next commentator. So that's a really great segue. Sometimes if you can't figure out, well, how would this map on, then you turn to the other commentators to see if from the way they're talking about it, they'll make it clearer. So this is, I'd like to officially move into our section on the Rishonim. So we're now leaving the Talmud and going forward in time. The period of the Rishonim, this is going to be between 1,000 and 1500s, the 1,000 and 1500s, so 11th century to 16th century. And the Rishonim comes from the word Rishon, or first. Meanwhile, they're really not the first, right? The first are really the Tanaim that are back in 0 to 200 CE, but they're called the Rishonim as opposed to the Achronim, which are the last. And they're going to come in from the 1600s on. So this period of time is called the period of the Rishonim. And the first Rishon that I want to look at is called, his shorthand is the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. The Rif, so right here, he's from Morocco from the 11th century. The Rif is really interested. What the Rif does, a lot of times if you have a Talmud, you can find him at the back of your Talmud. The Rif is interested in pulling out bottom line halakha, bottom line Jewish legal decisions. Because as I said, the Talmud is really not great as a law code. The Talmud is great if you want to like get into the head of a debate, dialectic back and forth. But if you're looking for, well, what is my bottom line halakha? You're not going to get it from the Talmud. That's not a great place to go. And also the Talmud has a real mix of stories and midrash interpretations and some law. And so the Rif, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, he's specifically interested in providing bottom line halakha, and he's only interested in dealing with halakha. So he basically, his commentary, he reads through the entire Talmud, and anything that's like story or midrash, he just skips over till he gets to the next legal discussion, and then he's going to pull out the bottom line legal decision for you. So if you take a look at this text for me, this is the Rif commenting on Masechet Brachot, on Tractate Brachot, and he says, so where it's taught, Veha dekatani tefila b'kol lashon, so where it's taught in the Mishna that the Amidah, tefillah, can be said in any language, Hani mile batzibur. This is referring to prayer that is in the community. Aval biyachid, lo. But prayer that is prayer of the individual, no. It cannot be said in any language. So, all right, that's an answer to your question of had you read that Gemara and you were still unsure how to map it. The Rif is actually just sort of saying out the bottom line of that Gemara, but saying it out where it said that you can say the Amidah in any language. You can say the Amidah in any language only when you're davening b'tzibur in a community. But if you're davening beyachid as an individual, then no, you cannot say it in any language. And that's how he sort of maps it out for you. And how do we know this? He then is going to quote what we saw in Sota. We know that if you're davening as an individual, you can't, because it's like Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, that one should never ask for one's needs in Aramaic. And Rabbi Yochanan said, anyone who asks for his needs in Aramaic is not attended to by the ministering angels, because the ministering angels don't understand Aramaic. So the idea there is, as we saw in the other text, why as an individual can you not say your prayers in any language? Because as an individual, let me say it in the reverse. Why, according to, based on here what we're seeing here, why in the community can you say your prayers in any language? Because when you're davening in a community, you have the power of the minyan. You have the power of having at least 10 people or more, the strength of a minyan. And where you have a minyan, there's this idea that the prayer has a more direct line to God, that those prayers are sort of heard more strongly or more powerfully, the power of praying together. And so because you have the power of the minyan, you don't need that extra help of the conduit of the angels to get your prayer up to God. But when you're davening alone, you no longer have the backing of the minyan, of the community supporting you. There's a feeling of and in that position, your prayer needs that extra super boost to get up to God. And that boost has to come through Lashon HaKodesh. It has to come through the language so that the angels can convey your prayer up to God. But when you're in the community, you have the boost of the community, and so therefore you don't need the angels acting as the intermediary, and so you can pray in any language. And so just to point out what the Rif is doing here, he's not, I don't think, offering anything particularly new or revelatory. This is basically what we saw as the bottom line of Sota. What he is doing is he's codifying this. He could have gone with the Mishna or Tosefta and said, no, tefillah in any language, and he's actually siding with the bottom line. Or you could have gone with the Urushami, which was preserving a more open, inclusive path, prayer in any language, but he chooses to go with the Babylonian Talmud, the bottom line of that, which said when the Mishnah that really minimized the Mishnah, said when the Mishnah said in any language, it only meant in community, but b'yachid, when you're praying alone, that's got to be not in Aramaic. Okay, questions or thoughts on what the Rif is doing there?
Yeah, while people are chatting, so here's the modern question. So if you're praying online with a community and you're in your room and they're in their room, do you have to pray in Hebrew? Or because you're praying together online, can you pray in any language you want?
Yeah, I love that question, Ari. I actually, again, you just keep providing me all the segues I want. The next text is not going to specifically answer your question, but I think it's going to get at enough of your question that I'm then curious to see if you'll feel it answers it enough. So the question there, Ari, you're asking specifically about online. If I'm praying alone, but I'm online, so I'm connected to the community, isn't it enough like being connected to the community? The next rabbi, he's not going to be asking the online question, but he's going to be asking that question in a similar way. Are there any ways in which the prayer of the individual actually is transformed and it's enough like the prayer of the community such that it can be done in any language? So he's asking your question in a different way. So let's take a look at that. And again, feel free if things are coming up to put them in the chat, and then I'll check on them after this next text, which I think is pretty amazing. So this next commentary is coming from the Rabbeinu Yonah. The Rabbeinu Yonah is specifically commenting on the Rif. Again, just sort of talking about the dynamic, how dynamic the world of the rabbis is. It's not even that the Rabbeinu Yonah is commenting on the Gemara, he's commenting on the Rif, who's commenting on the Gemara. So you just have these layer upon layers of commentary, which I think is so beautiful. So the Rabbeinu Yonah is Rabbeinu Yonah Gerendi. He's living in Spain in the 13th century. So he's 2 centuries later than the Rif. Again, it's sort of amazing that he's being put in conversation with him. So Rabbeinu Yonah says, since we have concluded that private tefillah, that private amidah can only be said in Hebrew, right? He's taking that based on where did we conclude that private tefillah can only be said in Hebrew. Remembering, that's not what the Mishna said. That's not what the Tosefta said. That's not what the Urushami said. Who said that? That was the bottom line of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and that's the bottom line of the Rif, who's come. And the Rif is very important. That was the Rif's bottom line as being like a halachic posek, a halachic rule maker. So Rabbeinu Yonah is taking that for granted because he's commenting on the Rif. So he's saying, basically saying, when the Rif, meaning when we concluded that private tefillah, it turns out, can only be said in Hebrew, I am deeply puzzled by the universal custom of women to pray in other languages, since by virtue of their obligation in prayer, they should have to pray in Hebrew like everyone else. So he's noticing something. This is part of what's so interesting about what a Rishon, meaning one of these commentators from this time period, is doing. They're doing a couple of things. One, they're trying to resolve contradictions. If they see contradictions between different perspectives, they're going to try to resolve them. 2, they're looking to offer bottom line guidance. So they're looking to offer psak, like bottom line, what is the Jewish law practice? And 3, they're doing that not only by looking at the different legal sources that came before them, they're also looking at what's going on in the world. And he said, okay, I understand that the Rif said that we're not supposed to pray, that individual prayer has to be in Hebrew, but I look around at the people in my community, I look around at the women, and they all seem to, all these religious, pious women, all seem to be davening in their own personal language. So there's a real disconnect, because on one hand, you're telling me this is the law, but women are obligated in prayer in the same way, and assuming that they are, which is true for this text, then women should also have to be davening in Hebrew, and they're not. And so how could it be? So now Rabbeinu Yonah has a problem that he has to resolve. How could it be that if in their individual prayer they have to daven in Hebrew, that doesn't seem to be the case of all these religious women? The rabbis of France try to justify this practice by saying that when an individual prays the same tefillah, the same prayer that is recited in public, meaning the Amidah, it's considered public, and one can say it in another language. So here, Ari, this is what I think is so amazing. What it seems to be saying up until now, and what it seemed like what the Rif was saying, is as soon as you're saying the Amidah as an individual at home and not with the community, even though you're saying the same text, it could be you're saying the same liturgy, just by defect of saying it not with the power of the minyan of the community behind you, you need that extra help of the ministering angels. And so the Rif would say, you can't say it in Aramaic, or you have to say it in Hebrew. So you get that power boost. And the Rabbeinu Yonah is saying, if the text you're saying in your individual prayer is the communal prayer, is fixed liturgy that the community is davening, it transforms your individual davening into community davening. And therefore, it gives you that extra, even though you don't actually have a minyan that you're pairing with, it gives you the extra boost as if you were in community, and therefore you can say it in any language because you don't need that extra power boost. And that which Rabbi Yehuda said, one should never ask for one's need in Aramaic, applies only when asking for one's private needs, such as praying for a sick person or regarding any other problem in one's home. But tefillah, the Amidah, which is known by the whole community, even when one prays in its own home, it is as if it is being prayed in public. It is being prayed in public, and if one does not know Hebrew, one may fulfill one's obligation in any language. So he helps us a lot in the sense, like he helps us a lot in the sense of if the goal is to be able to pray in any language, or if the goal is to understand why these women who are religious, pious women are praying the Amidah in whatever language they're praying, he helps us a lot because he said actually individual prayer can be transformed into communal prayer if they're saying the set communal text. That's very powerful. It still creates a problem because it says, well, prayer that is really, really individual, like if you're doing spontaneous prayer or prayer that's specifically about asking about your individual sickness or healing or things like that, that's still, according to him, he can't make that work because that's not in the language of formalized set prayer. That's about your individual needs. So he still would say that can't be in Aramaic, or that would have to be in Hebrew, which I think is still counterintuitive, because that would mean like if your home spontaneous prayer that you're doing about healing, spontaneous request to God, under this logic, that would still not be able to be in your home language, which is difficult. But he's now made it so that this whole category of individual prayer has to be in Hebrew. It can now be in any language because that individual prayer, if it's fixed liturgy, it is as if it's communal prayer. And the reason that public requests are made in any language, but private needs are not, is because the community, when praying as a whole, does not need an intermediary with God, but an individual does. And the ministering angels only attend to requests made in Hebrew. Again, here you have that slippage where it's like, is the problem that the angels don't understand Aramaic, or that they only attend to requests in Hebrew? Is the problem that you can pray in any language, but just not specifically Aramaic, or no, Aramaic is standing in for you can't pray in any language that is not Hebrew? It's not clear there. I think for me, this Rabbeinu Yonah text feels particularly powerful, specifically right now, where a lot of us are praying from our homes, because a lot of us might have the feeling of like we're praying alone for the first time during a season in which often this is a prayer that we're doing, like Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the days where you go to shul and pray with your community. And what is it my local minyan, they were organizing some services outside, very limited. Kids couldn't be there. I have a 2-year-old and 5-year-old, so like shul was just out for us. I don't use technology on Shabbat or the holidays. So I prayed the Rosh Hashanah liturgy by myself in my room, which is very bizarre. I've never done that probably in my entire life. And what the Rabbeinu Yonah is saying is actually that prayer that you thought was prayer of the Yachid, of the individual, actually is prayer that was of the community, which for me feels particularly powerful to say, even if you don't have the physical support of the community, you actually have the power of the community even when you're alone. Okay, I'm curious to hear your thoughts and responses to this. So just go ahead, put them in the chat there. So Phyllis says, what about praying in transliteration where the prayer is said in Hebrew, but you don't know the content and fulfill this obligation in sound only? Yeah, so Phyllis, I think that this is really important. I think that we're going to close today. I'm going to jump to the last text on the page after we hear a little bit of thoughts. So I think, Phyllis, that's a lot of the tension that they're wrestling with here is, do we care about everyone needs to be praying the same language because we care about the sort of standardization, the community, this Lashon HaKodesh, the holy language, the tapping into the power of a fixed liturgy? Or actually, if you're praying in transliteration and you don't understand, you're doing it in sound only, but you don't understand what you're saying, is there something really lacking here? That goes back to Rabbi Yossi, who was getting mad at the other guy. He was saying, stop praying in Greek. And he was saying, what do you want them to be doing? Not understanding the prayers that they're saying. It's important that people can understand what they're praying. So there are these different tensions at stake. Is it better to pray in transliteration, feel like you're part of the community but not know what you're saying? Or actually, is it more important that you understand what you're saying so you can ask what you really need? So Joanne says, if individual prayer can only be prayed in Hebrew, then they are assuming that individuals know Hebrew enough to fashion their own prayers in Hebrew as compared to praying liturgy prayers that they may have learned in community or school. Yeah, so Joanne, that's a big problem. They are assuming that. The assumption that if individual personal prayer, even in the Rabbeinu Yonah, if your sort of very personal prayer can only be said in Hebrew, then I don't know, Joanne, that the assumption is that people know Hebrew that well, but I think that unfortunately that is then what is being demanded of people. I think the reality is that people don't actually know Hebrew that well, and that's the problem. If we require that personal prayer be in Hebrew, then it means that all of these people, either they're doing something wrong because they're praying in the wrong language, and that feels horrible, that their prayer is wrong in some way or less valid, or they don't have access to it, so they're just not going to pray at all. It's setting people up to fail if by requiring them to only pray in a language that they don't know. And I think that was a problem. I think that's a problem for us today of making prayer accessible, inclusive. And I think that was already a problem for Rabbi and Yonah in his time, which is why you're seeing people praying in whatever language that they know. Do we all need to say prayer alone in the same time? Ria, are you saying for our prayers to be like as if we're at the community? I think the answer is no, which is what's so powerful about this. I think it's actually like just the set liturgy acts as a vehicle that we don't need to be saying at the same time. The text as the vehicle carries us. And by the text, I mean the content, right? Because it's not even the same words. The content, the fact that even in different languages, we're saying the same thing is enough to make it all together. I want to look at one more text together before we close. So the Rif, remember, was holding down and saying personal prayer has to be in Hebrew. Rabbeinu Yonah is redeeming it as much as he can and saying, well, personal prayer, as long as it's fixed, it becomes like communal prayer, and then it could be in any language. This response, which we're not going to look at in person together right now, is sort of phenomenal. He basically is like, this is crazy. It can't be. First he says, at the end of the day, he says, prayer is asking something from the Creator. And obviously it has to be, it can't be that you could, like, the angels or God only understand Hebrew. Like, we're talking about God here. It must be that if you're talking about God, God can understand in whatever language you need to God to understand. Let's not limit prayer in this way, which I think is just sort of an amazing response of, on one hand, you have prayer has to be, is holy and has to be in the holy language. And he's saying, no, prayer is about you asking for your needs directly with God. And obviously God can take it in whatever language you want to give it. And he basically just dismisses out. And then he says, we actually see people asking right here. He says, we see people asking for things in Aramaic individually. Obviously the angels can understand Aramaic. And then he said, it must be that we just have to disagree with these sages. We have to disagree with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yochanan, who say that you can't ask for things in Aramaic. They must just be wrong. This is where we're going to end today, because I don't want to rush the next text, so we'll just stop here. So the closing of this text there is, it must be based on the fact that people are that we see that people are actually davening in their home language. We must conclude that the rest of the sages disagree with them. And this whoever asked, Susan, I think, was asking this, and the statements of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yochanan, who say that the angels don't understand Aramaic, can it be that the angels who are appointed to record human speech do not know Aramaic, right? Not only, certainly, can God understand whatever language, clearly in the world in which we believe in angels who are appointed to be with humans could understand the language we speak. So, like, that's just crazy, he's saying. Even though we do not know the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yochanan and its origin, just as the earlier authorities were not concerned about their traditions, so too we are not concerned about them. We're going to start with this. We'll start with this text at our next session, but this is a bold move for a Rishon to make, of basically just dismissing the Amoraim outright and saying it can't be that their attempt to narrow prayer and say that it could only be in Hebrew, it can't be, because it's going against the Mishna, it's going against the Tosefta, and it's going against common practice of what I see people around me are doing. And so therefore, I'm not only going to not try to resolve that tension, I'm actually going to say, outright, we're not concerned about them. That's a really, really bold move. And so we'll pick up on that next week.
I would like to add, though, that the Talmud specifically says that you just can't pray in Aramaic. It doesn't say about English. So English would be fine.
Well, but that's what's so tricky. Exactly, Ari. So from the Talmud, you could maybe say, well, maybe it's just saying just not Aramaic is the problem. Actually, there's a commentary that I didn't show you. Is that after this one? It
was kind of a joke, but it depends.
No, it's not a joke, Ari.
Depends how you translate Aramaic.
Right here, the Rosh, a major commentary of the 13th, 14th century, says exactly what you're saying. He says it must be specifically, it poses no difficulty because it was specifically made in Aramaic. It must be specifically those women. The reason why it's okay, those women in France, is because they're praying in France. They're not praying in Aramaic. So the Rosh was specifically that. He reads it really narrowly and says, oh, when the Talmud says not Aramaic, it means not Aramaic. And so therefore English would be okay. But there are other commentaries that we saw that read it as, well, the ministering angels only respond to Hebrew. And so that would push you in but you're right on, and sort of like, do you read that really narrowly? Does not Aramaic mean, okay, but any other language is fine? Or not Aramaic means, no, it has to be Hebrew?
I would say it's the beauty of the Talmud that we've just seen, and particularly the rabbi arguing against the Talmud, but it's the frustration of the Talmud, because just because there was and I don't know what the Talmud Urushami says on this, but just because one or two rabbis don't agree with the Mishnah, why would the Talmud then create a whole new understanding of prayer that will then disenfranchise probably 90% of contemporary Jews who can't pray in Hebrew, don't know Hebrew, are not going to learn Hebrew, and are going to pray in the language that they want to pray? So there's a lot of stuff going on and why those rabbis would say what they did, but because of that, it has led to I think people's disenchantment with this process, because we just seen what could happen when you try to make every rabbi correct. Then you disenfranchise the people.
And then that's where you see these later Rishonim coming in and trying to go back to, well, then how do we get back to the Mishnah and Tosefta? How do we get back to this prayer that is more inclusive and acceptable?
Right. Well, good. That was it was a nice nice walk down a Talmudic street. I hope you all enjoyed it. It's a good way to start the new year, being confused. No, being involved in the Jewish learning process and understanding the beauty. But I'm glad we ended at least on a challenge of the Talmud, and we'll see where we go next week in the last part of this series. So as I mentioned before, this is really a 10-part series. We broke it into the first five parts that we're doing now, and we'll finish it. And I think in November, we'll continue with the next 5. We'll talk about what that means and where we're going to go on this journey. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I wish you all a happy new year and a healthy new year. And Yom Kippur is coming up, so go for some adventures online and go to different synagogues and, go to your own rabbis, but then hear what other rabbis have to say. Because as we've just seen, different rabbis have completely different views. And what's awesome right now is that you can see them all online in real time or tape delay. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you on Thursday.
Bye. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, everybody. Okay, back to work. Bye.